So, this is a profile. So I wanted to, start by asking you why you got into law.
Yeah, for me it was an evolution, right? When I was in college, after I got out of the army, I wanted to teach. So I was really heading to be a history teacher. And then before I knew, I wound up in the police department. And when I was in college in the transition early on, I played with the idea of going to law school, but it never, it didn't materialize. So I went into the police department. After a few years, I began to think that I wanted to get a graduate degree. And I was evaluating, do I get like an MBA, or do I get a law degree? And it was really after talking to many different people that I decided that I wanted to go to law school. Obviously, I went to law school later in life. I had already been a police officer for several years. But when I finally decided to go to law school, it was really driven by a thirst for having a better understanding of the law.
Was there anything you saw as a police officer that made you want to get on the other side of it?
Yeah, I don't think it was that necessarily. I think it was because, frankly, I never planned to leave the police department. I didn't. I went through a full career in the police department. But I felt that it would enhance my capacity at the time to do police work. And then I saw, after, we'll see. But it was not the immediate thought process for me. It was more about this is going to make me a better police officer.
So, what do you think you've learned in the last 4 years?
Well, look, I believe that life is a continuous journey of learning. I was a police officer here for about 27 years before I left, so I certainly understood the city of LA and the police in LAPD, and the interactions with the district attorney's office from one side of the curtain, if you will. I have been a police chief in 2 other cities, and I was a district attorney in San Francisco. LA has, like every community, they have their uniqueness, right? And one of the things that I've learned in the last 4 years has been the scope of the county, right? You think of the city as being large, which it is, but the city is 40% of the county, right? I never had to engage in working in the Arnold Valley or in Pomona or Long Beach or other parts of the county. My world as an LAPD officer and eventually an assistant chief in the LAPD was very LA city center. So in the last 4 years, I've gotten to know many communities that frankly I knew in passing, but not necessarily to the level that I know today. I think also, clearly the difference in how the district attorney's office operates today, and even when I left the police department in 2006, is in many ways is similar, in many ways it's not, right? There is technology is different. The size of the agencies are different. I left the LAPD, with nearly 10,000 officers and 13,000 civilians. LAPD now is, way under that, right? Our office was larger years ago than it is today. We've lost, positions. The way that we did the work back then, right? There were many things that were, that were prosecuted very differently, and there were other things that were not prosecuted at all. So, there's an evolution, and I certainly came in at a time where so much of that was happening at the same time that we had this unprecedented moment for for multiple generations, which is a pandemic, right? You would have to go back to 1918 to have a similar experience. Certainly, when it came to the whole world facing the devastation of a pandemic, and that also impacted our work. It impacted how we use technology today is very different than even when I first even got in the office, right? So there are many things that are different, things that consequently forces not only adaptation but it forces learning.
So you mentioned that when you were a police officer that the LAPD was a much larger force and that the DA's office also was much larger. Would you like to go back to those staffing levels? Would you like to see the LAPD numbers go back to what they were?
I think, I think for the size of the city of LA, the LAPD has always been understaffed, right? I think, when you compare the size of LAPD and the size of the city of LA to other places like New York or Chicago, or even places, quite frankly, even like San Francisco, when you're looking at the per capita number of police officers, the LAPD has always tended to be a smaller agency. I mean, I remember when I first started as a young officer, at that time the city had maybe a little over 3 million people and we had 6,500 officers. Now, clearly we were devastated back in those days, but we went through a renaissance where we were able to grow, and now that, there's a shrinkage. But there's no question that there's a need for more resources to the LAPD. Now, the resources, because of technology and the evolution of the law may be different, but the fact that I believe that the LAPD is understaffed, and not only the LAPD, frankly, but the LA County Sheriff and most other agencies around the county or around the country, it's a reality that we as a society need to assess. At the same time, I recognize anyway, that demographically we're also different. We're getting older. Policing generally has fed from, younger people coming out of the service, coming out of college. We as a population are getting older. So the evolution, how do we think what is the workforce and what would it look like, the recruitment pool. Also, not only are we getting older, which impacts recruitment certainly for policing, but there's also a shrinkage in general terms of people that would normally be eligible to do the work, right? So I think that there's a combination of things that creates opportunities for policymakers, chief of police, mayors, and city councils to think about, okay, how do we staff policing? What are the things that have to be done by a sworn police officer? What are the things that could be done by, paraprofessionals that can deal with very specific areas of the work that may not be a full-blown police officer? So I think there's a lot of room for exploration, and I think the necessity will force that, by the way. But there is no question that there's a need to have, a greater footprint within policing, or we have to take a whole bunch of work away from policing and put it somewhere else, and then have whatever that somewhere else is handle some other work. We definitely cannot continue to expect policing to do all the things that we're asking them to do with the resources that we're giving them.
And you were elected following the George Floyd protests, and many of the people who were out protesting who also supported you have called for defunding the police. I know that has many meanings. Mm-hmm. Do you disagree with aspects of that? Because I'm hearing you say that you would like to see more police, but that police can't be doing everything with the resources.
Look, first of all, I think that the whole concept of defunding the police, I think it was a very inartful way of expressing, and you pointed it out very well. I think it means different things to different people. I think it goes from one extreme, the abolitionists that truly believe that we can do away with policing, and I certainly disagree with that, to other people on the spectrum that believe that, well, there may be a sizing of policing and what the function of policing is that needs to evolve. My take on all this is that policing is going to have to evolve just simply because, the world's evolving, right? Demographically, we're evolving, as I mentioned earlier. And I think that increasingly what we're asking police to do is I don't want to use the term unfair because unfair probably doesn't, but it's unrealistic. The many functions that we're asking police to do, which, by the way, in many other countries, we don't expect police to do this stuff, right? We expect police officers to be psychologists, social workers, enforcers. We expect them to do way too many things. And there's no question that there are times, a good police officer can do all of those and do them very well. But I think that we need to also begin to rethink what we expect people in uniform as a police officer to do.
And you know, your policies have been polarizing. There have been 2 recall attempts, and there have even been members of your own prosecutors who work for you who have challenged your policies. Would you do anything differently?
Well, we have. Okay, I mean, there's 2 components to this. Number one, you know, where we are today and where we were when I first got sworn in many ways, is different, right? We have created different avenues for exceptions even to the original policies that were, you know, initially they were implemented under, you know, one set of facts when, you know, we had a very small management team of people that believe in the work to what we are today. And again, if I were to be honored with a re-election and you and I had the same conversation 3-4 years down the line, I'm sure that there will be, you know, additional things that we would be doing then that we're not doing today. So there is no question that you can always take a look back and say, oh, yeah, I wish if I would have done that a little bit differently. On the other hand, there are some things that, okay, we have done differently. And you know, it's a continuous process of learning and evolving. And it's a two-way street, right? I see increasingly many people in the office that were very opposed to the things that I brought to the table, and now they're in a different place. So you know, it's been a learning process. On the other hand, there's some people that were opposed when I first came in, and they continue to be opposed today. And that, you know, we're also dealing with a shifting of a culture of a large organization and a profession. You know, I often tell people that if you look at somebody, let's say fossil fuels, and I could go into the tobacco industry, it doesn't matter, let's say fossil fuels, for instance, right? If you are someone that has spent your entire life and your livelihood has come from the production, the sale, the promotion of fossil fuels, and all of a sudden you view that industry is evolving and you know, fossil fuels may not be necessarily the profit point, and you know, and I think some of the fossil fuel companies are evolving very quickly and going to clean energy, and others are not. I think there is a moment of uncertainty, right? As human beings, we don't like change, right? I mean, that happens to all of us, and especially when the things that you have done for a very long time, maybe the things that you grew up professionally, are being challenged, that creates a tremendous amount of uncertainty, and I think it creates doubts. And so much of what you see here is a reaction to that, and you see it, like I say, you see it in other places, in other industries, as there is an evolution. I mean, you see it in policing too, right? You know, I came in policing at a time when we had people that had been police officers before Miranda came up, right? You know, the obligation to tell a suspect before you question them that they have a right to remain silent and all that stuff. And, you know, they came in as a young officer, and then now they were working with me sort of the tail end of their career. They had, for some people, it had been natural, you know, they evolved very quickly. Other people still remember. I remember working with some older partners that had, you know, 30 years in the force or plus, and say, I remember when we have to go through all that. And obviously they did not use the terms that I'm using. They're much more colorful. So, you know, for them, the changes were happening too quickly, and they were completely thrown off. I would suspect that people that came in and is still policing when I came in are having similar problems today. So, you know, there is a natural tendency for all of us as human beings, as things start to evolve, and sometimes very quickly, to create more uncertainty, more insecurity, and then, you know, we handle that stress differently.
And I know you can't comment on open cases, but these are 2 stories that I recall doing. One was a woman out in the Antelope Valley who was killed by her neighbor who was mentally ill, who stabbed her for making noise, but prior to that, about a year and a half prior to that, he had done the same to another neighbor. That neighbor survived, and he was put into a diversion program and let out again, and then he killed her. There was the other one too that I recall at Cal State here in Long Beach, a guy who had gone on to campus with a gun and then subsequently got out and attacked the two people in the synagogues. Are there any cases that you now look back on that you wish you had charged more harshly or differently?
Yeah, so let me kind of pose a different question for you, because how long have you been a reporter now? You look very young, so I don't mean
21 years.
Okay, yeah. So you certainly were reporting in this community under the prior DA, correct? Mm-hmm. Were there times when you saw cases where the prior DA prosecuted a case, and maybe not to the full extent, and then the person went out to commit another crime?
Yes, but what I'm asking though is, are there any that you wish you had?
Well, look, any time that there is a system failure, and for me, any time that there's a new crime, there's a system failure, you look back and you say, I wish if I would have done it differently, right? But we have an office that we run through tens of thousands of cases. I've been in this business for about 40 years now, when you include my policing time. And I can tell you that many times over, when we went to a homicide scene, that person had prior contact with law enforcement. In some cases, very serious contact, and they have been prosecuted, or maybe they have not been prosecuted, and they went out then to commit other crimes, right? We have a very high failure rate in our system, right? Unlike any other developed nation, right? Our recidivism rate is over 60%. Comparable nations are around 10%. Now we're learning from that. By the way, we have programs now like the Amity Foundation, where we're working in a different reentry world where the recidivism rate is about 10%. But we're not there as a system yet, right? So we know that people are going to get released. About 95% of the people that get prosecuted and go to prison, not just in LA County, nationwide in California, they go back out, right? And some of those people go back to reoffend. And the problem is, every time that somebody causes harm, it's a failure, right? And I could go back, and every time that, we've looked at a case when I was a police officer and I was a prosecutor, where somebody was touched by us one way or the other, and then they came back and harm again, and you look back and you say, that was a failure. So there's no question that retrospectively, I tell people the rear view mirror has 20/20 vision, right? But we also know that there are many people that we touch that actually are very successful, and sometimes through the use of a different way of approaching. For instance, we have resentenced over 300 people in the office so far. Now, we go through a lot of work before we resentence someone. We're very methodical about looking at whether they are showing all the evidence of rehabilitation. Out of those 300 plus people, only 4 have reoffended. Very low recidivism rate. Now, clearly those 4 was a failure, right? But when you look at the reality that, actually over 300 of those 300 plus have not reoffended, those are all success stories that you don't get to report on because they do not come back as a system failure. So yes, every time that we touch someone and somehow they go back and cause harm again, I regret it. I look back and I try to do better the next time. But this is nothing new. This is going on with prior DAs, and it will go on with future DAs. The only difference is, years ago, we were not blaming the district attorney for this stuff. When I was a cop, I never heard anybody say the DA was the cause of a crime increase. We certainly never credit DAs with lowering crime, right? Cops took credit for the lowering. We never took credit for the increase. We always blame somebody else for the increase. There's a new expectation, but it's not unique also to our office or to prosecution. I think that we expect so much more of our elected officials today. We expect so much more out of everybody today than we did years ago, because in many ways we're capable to do so much more, right? So when we have those failures, it wears heavily on me, but I also recognize that, predicting human behavior with 100% certainty is an impossibility, and we don't work in a world of certainty. We work in a world that you try to do the best that you can with the tools that you have.
So your critics don't question that there is, recidivism, no matter who's DA. What they are saying, though, is that you're missing opportunities to charge people with charges that would keep them in jail longer, and that is leading to an increase in crime.
Well, first of all, I mean, the question of increase in crime is, we know that according to the Attorney General's office, when you go from 2019 to 23, crime in the county has gone up, right? But we also know that we have 88 cities, and crime has not gone up in every city, number one. And we also know that under a prior DA, it was actually a substantial increase in crime. In fact, 2019 was an anomaly. If you look before 2019, 2018, 2017, the numbers are more closely to where we are today than in 2019. But, people are using 2019 as a market, and that's fair enough. Crime goes up and down. The reality is that also the same critics never look at all the levels of success that we've had, right? Again, we're concentrating on the failures, but you haven't asked me a single question about the 300 plus people that have been resentenced and are doing well, or the people that we have diverted and are doing very well. So, and I get it. Look,
so you don't is that higher than your predecessor?
The resentencing
yes.
part of it, she wasn't doing any. So there's no point of comparison. But see, the problem is, look, I understand, right? You cannot sell clicks if you tell people that things are all going well. And they're not, by the way. I'm not implying that they're all going well, right? We as human beings, I do the same thing. I read the paper, I look at the headlines, I look at the things that call my attention and generally unfortunately the bad things, whether it's national politics, international, or local, right? So, look, there's always room to do better. I'm very focused in doing not only the best I can each and every day, but getting better all the time. For 40 years, and I say that with complete clarity, I have gone to bed and get up in the morning thinking about how to do my work better. And my work has been around public safety. Just the role has been different from a patrol officer, supervisor, captain, chief, and now district attorney. So I deeply care about the safety of the community. By the way, this is the same community that I live, right? It's not like I put a Superman suit in the morning and come back here, right? I go home, I shop in the same shops that my community does. I raise a family. So I'm very sensitive to safety in our community. And I'm very concerned about how to do it better. I'm also concerned that thinking that going back to where we were before creates a false sense of we were in a better place, because we often weren't. And in fact, if you look over a longer period of time, homicides are down to historic levels, right? Again, if you use 2019 as a point of reference, there was no question there was a dip in 2019, not only in our county, but pretty much around. And then there was an increase that started in 2020. By the way, I was not the district attorney until December 7 of 2020. So 2020 began to see a very sizable increase that continued into 21 and 22. And by 23, it started to flatten up, and then 24 has come down in some places, and others it hasn't. And the only thing, and you talk to people that have been spending their life studying crime trends, and the only thing that people can point to is the pandemic, and whether the pandemic had an impact and to what level. I think you're going to have criminologists and you're going to have social scientists studying this for decades to come.
Do you have a tissue? Because just want to. There you go.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Hold that thought, because I do want to follow up on that.
Sure. Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
These lights always do that.
Yeah, the lights will start.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for pointing it out.
No problem. So, I know that I understand the argument about national trends and so forth, but when we're out in the field, we interview a lot of victims of crime, and very often they do blame you.
Yeah.
So what would you say to them?
Well, look, first of all, I feel their pain, and for people that have been victimized, I feel horrible for them, right? Because it doesn't really matter what the trends are. If you were the victim of a crime, or someone that you know was a victim of a crime went up for you 100%. And I feel that I that I not only have to acknowledge that, but it's one of the driving forces behind my efforts. It's always taking a look and see, as a system, where can we do better? The other part of that, though, is, and I think this is where, unfortunately, we're at a place that I think that often, because of politics, and I get that, by the way, this is a political world where a lot of misinformation takes hold, and often, quite frankly, is being put out there by regular media, by social media. I don't make arrests, right? I don't conduct investigations. Our job as a prosecutor is to review a case when the police makes an arrest, and if we believe that there is sufficient evidence, to prosecute the case accordingly. We have today very, very high filing rates, and that means very prosecution rates in terms of when police makes an arrest and us moving forward, especially for the things that have been occurring over and over. You talk about organized retail theft. We're filing over 90% of those cases. I mean, if the police makes an arrest, over 90% of the time, people are being prosecuted, and some of them very harsh. If your home was broken into, we're filing over 80% of those cases. Again, traditionally, in most areas other than homicides and some other, a lot of prosecution rates are significantly lower than that. They were significantly lower in many cases, even in our office before. We're doing that because two things are occurring. Number one, as the police starts to pay greater attention to the trend, which we do all the time, right? When I was a cop, it's the same thing. This crime goes up, we're always a step behind the criminals, but then we come up. We get better at identifying the people, then there's an arrest and there is a prosecution. But often you hear the thing, well, he lets everybody go, right? Or he doesn't prosecute anybody. But when you look at over 100,000 cases that have been prosecuted in the last 3.5 years, on par with the last 10-year average for crimes of violence and serious crimes. When you look at how we're prosecuting organized retail theft, when you look at how we're prosecuting residential burglaries, when you look at how we're prosecuting hate crimes, a higher rate than anybody in the state and higher rates than even this office before, those facts do not comport with the narrative out there. And I get that. But still, I go back to this thing that I started when you asked the question. If you were the victim of a crime, quite frankly, it doesn't matter what the crime rates are. Crime went up for you 100%, and I acknowledge that, and I want to make sure that you know that I care deeply about that.
So you're talking about filing rates, but the criticism is that you're not using enhancements or other tools at your disposal to make sure that they get the strongest sentence possible and send the strongest message.
Yeah. So look, so a couple of things here, right? Because let's break this down, right? Number one, in general terms, when you're talking about enhancement, you're talking about people who already are going to go to prison for decades, and whether you add another decade or two, the outcome of that, if it were failure, would not be seen for many, many years from now, right? So let's first of all say that even if there was some truism to the argument that enhancements actually create more safety, whether they do or not, we won't know for years to come, right? So that's the one, because people are going to prison, and they're going to prison for very long periods of time. That's one. But the second piece, the issue of enhancements, which I find problematic, because it almost seems to be used as somehow someone that is ready to commit a crime will think about, oh my God, if the DA puts an enhancement on me, that's going to give me another 5 or 10 or 15 years over the 20 or whatever I'm going to get, and somehow I'm not going to commit the crime. And we know that that is not the case, because when people are committing crimes, there are different motivations, whether it's emotions, whether it's profit, whether it's environmental. People are not thinking about enhancements. And that's why the death penalty is such a failure, because the death penalty doesn't deter anybody, right? When people kill other people, they are not thinking that they may get the death penalty, right? When people are committing crimes, for whatever reason it is, they're not going to be thinking about the consequences. There are some exceptions to that, and those exceptions usually lie with white-collar crime. very sophisticated people. They think that they can outsmart everybody, but they also worry about going to prison sometimes. But when you're talking about the work that we do when it comes to violence in the streets and all that stuff, the utility of an enhancement as to a deterrent has been proven over and over not to work, right? Now, I understand that that is not the conversation that you hear, but that's what social science, that's what research tells us. And as I mentioned earlier, even if that were to be the case, the outcome of that would not be seen for years, because people are going to prison for very long periods of time when they commit serious crimes.
And your opponent has tried to make this a referendum on your policies, which he calls extremists. Mm-hmm. And the latest poll does show that you're behind almost 30 points. Do you think that this election is a referendum on your policies?
Well, first of all, look, I think that the only poll that matters is the poll on election day, right? And we saw that in 2020. I understand what the poll says, but I also understand that generally the people that respond to poll, first of all, generally the people that are polled are the people that are very frequent voters. Number one, and number two are generally people that want to be polled, right? I mean, I don't know about you, but I get hit for polls at least 2 or 3 times a week. I don't answer one because I don't have the time. But more importantly, we know that usually in elections like the one that we're going to have this in 3 weeks will be very high voter turnout election. That will bring also a very different voter to the table. And that outcome, I believe, that will be different, right? So that's one. But secondly, and I believe that's a real referendum, right? I mean, we were way behind on the polls October 15th of 2020. And we not only prevailed, but we prevailed by a good margin, about 250,000 people more than my opponent. So you could argue that that was a referendum on that. But the other part of this is that I think that, my opponent talks about blanket policies, right? But then he forgets a couple of things. Number one, before I came into office, we had blanket policies that generally went to the extreme of punishment, with very few exceptions. And number two, he himself has said, especially when he's amongst more conservative people and Republican groups, he will prosecute every crime to the fullest. Now, I understand that when he is in other places, then he talks about diversion. My opponent has different sort of narratives depending where he is, which is consistent with the way that he ran for Attorney General in 2022. Right, in 2022, he also ran as a Republican, and he had a narrative that is very consistent with the way he will talk to Republicans. And I know this because I have a lot of friends that are Republican. I grew up in a Republican household, and I still have a lot of those friends. And yet, when he goes into other places, he says things differently. Unlike my opponent, I'm very consistent. I believe that people that cause harm, they need to be held accountable, that accountability needs to be proportionate, and it needs to be in light of the entirety of our work, because we represent entire communities. And so much of what we have today is a failure of those blanket policies that we had before, that basically saw only the maximum punishment as the answer. And by the way, we don't have blanket policies. We make a lot of exceptions. My opponent talks about enhancements. We've done nearly 15,000 gun enhancements since I've been in office. Now, grant you, under the prior administration, they did many more, but here's the type of gun enhancements that we're not doing. Under the prior administration, somebody say, we saw a gun, even though a gun was never recovered and a gun wasn't the tool of the crime, they would often file an enhancement for a gun. We don't do that today. If we file a gun enhancement, it's because the gun was there and was the tool of the crime. We file special circumstances in cases, which means that somebody would go to life without the possibility of parole. But again, we do it in a much more measure. So there is no blanket policy, but we are careful that the exceptions do not swallow the rules, because we don't want to get to the place where we go back to over-incarcerated levels that provide not only no safety for our community, but often take away from the resources that we sorely need in order to get our work done and do address violence.
And getting back to something you said earlier, where you said that DAs don't get credit for, or police get credit for lowering crime rates. Are there tools at your disposal that can help lower crime rates?
Look, I think that so much of what we do is retroactive, right? We respond to an act that was committed by someone and then a police arrest, which is generally a very small number of people that commit crimes get arrested. Let's take property crimes, for instance. Typically, if you're committing residential burglaries, let's say, typically only 15% of the time you're going to get caught, right? So let's begin by understanding the threshold upon which people are going to get arrested for committing a crime and that they're going to be prosecuting is very low. The majority of the people that engage in criminal activity generally don't get caught, right? Obviously, the percentages thankfully go higher when you're dealing with homicides, but even homicides, if you look at homicide solvability, it's around 50% across the nation, right? LAPD has a little higher numbers, but we have other agencies in the county that have lower, which means that even people that commit murder will often get away with. And that's why people, sometimes go out to repeat offend because they're still out there. My job as a prosecutor is to make sure that when the police makes an arrest, that we evaluate the case and that we hold that person accountable for the harm that they cause and try to be proportionate in the way that we do so, and also manage resources that are very limited, right? We know that we have limited jail space. We know that we have limited court space. So we have to also be very sensitive that we don't work in a vacuum and that we have to address our work in a way that reflects not only the harm that was caused and the likelihood of more harm, but also the resources that we have in relationship to the work that we're doing.
I want to talk to you too about mental health, because unfortunately, we've covered many stories where someone was mentally ill and out on the streets and someone got killed or hurt. So what can the DA do about that?
Yeah, well, first of all, when somebody kills someone, and assuming that there's an arrest, what we do is we prosecute the case, right? And we prosecute the person for murder according to the evidence and the circumstances. The other thing that the DA gets to do is the DA gets to work with other partners. Like in my case, since I work with the Board of Supervisors, work with the Board of Supervisors to make sure that we have more capacity to deal with those people that have committed a crime and are also mentally ill, right? And there are different thresholds there, so creating capacity to make sure that people that are mentally ill and are causing harm is being addressed, again, proportionate to what they did, is very important for me. So that is a major role that I play. Not necessarily that I create the additional space, but that I work hard to make sure that that is created by others. But beyond holding people accountable and beyond using the bully pulpit to make sure that all the other stakeholders in the space dedicate resources to do this work. I'm working with legislators to make sure that we pass laws. And the amount of influence that we're going to have in the big scope of mental health problems or drug addiction is very limited to the capacity that we have to prosecute cases or to deal with other stakeholders to try to create space to make sure that people that are having a mental health problem and are committing crimes are being given an opportunity to be held accountable in a way that it makes sense.
Are there any endorsements that you're particularly proud of?
Look, I'm proud of every endorsement, and we have hundreds of endorsements right now, from regular citizens to political leaders, the Board of Supervisors, to organizations, to labor. We have tremendous amount of, labor support, including the County Federation of Labor. We have the County Democratic Party. We have, the large majority of the Democratic clubs throughout the county. We have the endorsement of Planned Parenthood. I'm very proud of the endorsement that was given to me by Planned Parenthood, primarily because while people think that California doesn't have to worry about protecting women's reproductive rights, actually they're wrong. We see that often clinics and even our own community are under assault. We know that women and girls that are trying to seek health care are often being ridiculed. Their photos are being posted on the internet. They're being discouraged from seeking health care. So my partnership with Planned Parenthood is one that I'm very proud of in their endorsement, but I have the support of environmentalists. I have the support of many community-based organizations. If you look at the numbers of endorsements that we have, is very broad. It goes from now Congressman Garcia, the mayor of Long Beach, to 3 members of the board of supervisors, to many other organizations, and I'm very proud of each and every one of them. And I'm proud of them for many reasons. I'm proud of them for the fact that they have placed their trust in me and they believe in the way that I'm doing the work. But more importantly, I'm proud of the fact that we find alignment in their missions and in the missions that we're trying to further in the district attorney's office.
And what is something about you that you think might surprise people?
Well, look, I think that, in the role as a district attorney, right, you're always, if I'm in camera, I'm wearing a tie, I'm wearing a white shirt or a blue suit. I've actually like to wear jeans and a t-shirt. I love dogs. I have a wonderful family life. I really enjoy my family. I'm pretty simple in the way that I live my life. I like to cook, and my wife and I do a lot of our own cooking. I like to travel, but I like to travel simply too, including camping. And then, I think a lot of people, especially, and that's, just in the last 4 years, I think that people think that somehow like this criminal-friendly prosecutor, which is so far from the truth, right? Because I'm very concerned about the safety of our community, but I'm also concerned about how to create a better system. And I think that often people don't realize that, or people think that we're not prosecuting cases. And when you tell them, well, you realize that we're prosecuting at rates, especially serious and violent crime, that average for the last 10 years. I think people get honestly surprised because they've heard so much that speaks to a different narrative.
And I did, getting back to the poll, it did show also that there was about 20% of LA County voters that were still undecided on this race. And I did talk to some. And what I heard from some was that they didn't like your policies. They thought that they were too extreme. But then they thought that Hochman was as well. What would you say to those voters?
Well, look, we're having different experiences. I understand you're out there, but we're out there too, right? So we're doing phone banking. We got a lot of volunteers doing phone banking. I tell you that what we're hearing from the people that are doing phone banking is a very different story than the one you're hearing. Now, that's not to say that there may be people out there that, that are undecided either way, because they may not be completely aligned with either one or the way that we believe the work should be done. But I also know there are a lot of people that are very supportive, especially once they understand the things that I'm telling you. When we tell people, you understand that he prosecuted over 100,000 serious and violent cases, and that is consistent with the average of the last 10 years, and you get an aha moment, and people say, well, I didn't know that. I thought nobody was being prosecuted. Or do you understand that, for instance, no cash bail for low-level offenses and non-serious crimes is not the policy of the DA per se, but it's the policy of the courts, and it's based on a Supreme Court decision, even though I don't believe in cash bail. I don't believe in cash bail because we have so many instances where we've seen people that can afford to pay cash and they go out and continue to cause harm because we're releasing them, not because of whether they're dangerous or not, but because they have the money in the bank. And when you tell people that's a court policy and the DA really doesn't create, people get surprised by that because they have been told that we let everybody go. When we educate people and say, you understand the police makes the arrest, prosecutor prosecutes, the court decides what sentence, often people they said no. I just had a conversation this morning with someone, said, well, you let everybody go. I said, well, tell me who I let go. And then when I kind of walked this person through the process, I said, well, I've been led to believe that you make the decisions of who's going to get released or who's going to get let go. Well, no, we don't, right? So much of this is also educating people. And when people understand what the different roles are within the system, and they understand that, quite frankly, they have been led to believe otherwise, there is also that aha moment for people that even have decided. I have to tell you, actually, I had a lady recently who, was going to vote for my opponent. And then a mutual friend sort of asked her why, and there was an educational call, and then she called me and says, you know what, I apologize because I had this so wrong, right? So this is where I hope that, quite frankly, conversations like you and I are having today will be exposed to the fullest. And I understand you're not going to have an hour airtime for me, but I hope that, in that editing process, that the flavor of the fullest extent possible of this conversation actually gets exposed, because when people are informed, then the decisions sometimes become a different decision.
Okay. Can you get two shot?
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you.
Cristy, slide in the hair.
What?
Slide in. Just close it. Shoot.
Do you, if you are reelected, do you expect that there will be more recall attempts?
I would hope not. I would hope that we've learned that there were $10 million to spend in 2 recall attempts. Right, one was about 2, the second one was about $8 million. And I think that the public showed very clearly that was not going to be the way that they wanted the process to work. So I'm hoping that there will be, that we will stop that. And I hope that you guys will assist us in educating the public, so maybe we can actually get on to do more of the work without having to deal with recalls. The time to elect or not is in 3 weeks from now, right? And if I get reelected, I would hope that then for the next 4 years, we roll up our sleeves and work together to make sure that our community is a better place.
And another thing that I've heard, and I want to get your response to this more than once, is that people will call us and they're having an issue, and they say they call the police, and the police have told them, well, there's nothing we can do because there's no sense in arresting them because the DA is just going to let them go.
Yeah, and that's a problem, right? I mean, I'll give you one instance, right? I have a good friend of mine whose home was burglarized in Studio City, right? He had cameras, and the police came in. This happened to be the LAPD, which pains me greatly, because if you cut me, I tell people I bleed LAPD blue, because I spent most of my professional career working for the LAPD. And these officers came in, and they told the gentleman whose home was burglarized, said, look, we didn't take a report. By the way, his home was broken into, property was taken, and he was told there's nothing, the DA won't do anything about it. So my friend said, well, interesting you say that, because I happen to have his personal cell number, so why don't we call him right now, unless the 4 of us, because there were 2 officers, him and I have a conversation. And he pulled out the phone and he showed him, and he started to dial on the officer. Oh, stop, we'll take a report, and we'll make sure that it gets investigated. And then he thanked him, but he called me, right? And I had the officer's name, and I talked to then Chief of Police Michael Moore. I said, look, this is not only not true, but it's really not providing the best service to the community, right? And he agreed with me, and we have seen that happen over and over again, right? Now, why is that occurring? I think you have to ask the police why.